So I'm gonna kick you out.
Yep. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. And next up we have Michael Mittelman, and I didn't mention this till recently, but we also have Andrea Downing. So I'm gonna admit them all at the same time. Hi, Michael.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you. Wow, Andrea, you're like in the Sistine Chapel or something.
Well, this is a Pantheon. This is my favorite building. So I thought when all of this pandemic is over, I'm going to travel the world again, and I want to go back to Italy and the Pantheon, and got family from my in-law. Anyway, hi, nice to meet you.
I'm glad.
And I just changed. Now I'm at Independence Hall in Philadelphia.
And I'm just in my home office. How boring. So you guys can start. I am going to just turn my video feed off. And
okay.
You've got the floor now.
Awesome, thank you. And I muted Twitch, so hopefully the sound works well. Perfect. So thank you for having us, Kim. This is very exciting. I know that I am ecstatic to be here, and I'm ecstatic that Andrea and I are doing this together. So I want to briefly lay out for everybody what we're going to be talking today, right? So there's a couple of things here. So it's why we're doing the talk. I'll give you a little bit of background on myself and on Andrea. Or I'll ask her to do it also since she's in the room at the same time. And then we're going to start with some definitions. And then Andrea's kind of going to go talk about her part of the talk, which is really about threats to patient communities. So sort of threat modeling, what we call the digital Maginot Line, hacking groups, some examples of harm. But I want to start off with really the why we're doing this, right? So my name is Michael Mittelman. That's Andrea Downing, who you also see on screen. And she is all the way in the beautiful city of Eugene, Oregon. I'm coming to you live from Philadelphia. But why are we doing this, right? We are doing this because our healthcare data is more important than ever, particularly during the time of a pandemic. And if people didn't understand sort of what healthcare data is, I think they're getting a taste of it now, right? You're beginning to see things around contact tracing, and then what does that mean? And people are waking up to kind of understand what does their healthcare data have to do with all of this, and how should they start trying to protect themselves? So a little bit about myself. As I told you, my name's Mike, and I am a 3-time kidney transplant recipient, so I very much lived in the disability world. I have epilepsy. I had end-stage renal disease from the time I was a little kid, and so I've grown up with that. I have a number of other chronic autoimmune conditions as well, but kidney disease, dialysis, transplant, epilepsy, these have all been sort of running themes throughout my life. And so I've spent a lot of different times in hospitals, and it was only in sort of recent years that I began to think about what is all of the data that's accumulated on me over these years, right? And what can I get access to that? So with that, since Andrea's in the room, I want to let her give a brief introduction of herself, and then we'll get moving on some definitions. Can you hear us, Andrea?
Yes, can you hear me
Awesome.
okay?
Yes, indeed.
All right, so my name is Andrea. I'm really excited to be at this conference, and thank you, Kim, for organizing. So Mike and I have known each other for about 2 years. I am also an ePatient. We're going to talk a little bit more about ePatients and the history of the ePatient movement. But for me, I came into this world as a mutant. In all the places my genome could have gone right and could have gone wrong, my future changed when I was 25 and learned that I had a TNAG that somehow got switched on place 181 on my BRCA1 gene. And in a lot of ways over the last 14 years for me, it's about scaling the learning curve of cancer data sharing, variant classification, and understanding how our community's data, specifically for the BRCA community, has impacted me, my future, and how we think differently about our data as a way to shape our own destinies. So I'll talk a little bit more about my start into this world, which was in 2013. And then, as Mike said, I will go into some of the threats and things that I found a couple of years ago and how that applies to us as communities. So take it away, Mike.
Thank you, Andrea. All right, so let's kind of talk with some definitions here, right? So I think already one definition has been used. And so I went with the rule of no slides here. So let's see if you guys can see something that I hold up to the screen. So I'm going to try to hold this up. It does not work when you have a digital background. I can get rid of it. But what it says is ePatient, okay? And I think we want to ask ourselves, what is this word, right? Andrea used the word already. And my screen seems to be a little glitchy, but I'm just going to roll with it. Sometimes it's ePatient, sometimes it's e-patient. And really what we're talking about is the empowered patient, or somebody who is an electronic patient, an engaged patient. The way that a lot of us also like to think about the word is really somebody who understands their own data in a way so that they can chart their own destiny, right? And this is about understanding your data and utilizing that data for your own good, but also to help maybe make some informed decisions for those in the community around you. So I want to talk about another definition very briefly as we kind of line things up here. And I will not go too much into depth here, but the next one being Hipaa, right? This is another one of these that people tend to talk a lot about. H-I-P-A-A is the proper spelling. It's not H-I-P-P-A or P-P-A-A. We see a lot of different spellings of this. But Hipaa essentially has a number of different components to it. Andrea may dive a little bit deeper into this, but there are really 5 components, sort of the privacy rules, security rules, some enforcement rules, an omnibus rule, and something called a breach notification rule. So it's regulated by the Department of Health and Human Services, but enforcement is really left up to the Office for Civil Rights. And we all think about it a little differently, but I like the CDC's definition, so I want to read this to you. So the way they actually define it as the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. Yes, if you can believe it, 1996 is a federal law that required the creation of national standards to protect sensitive patient health information, or what we know as PHI, or protected health information or personal health information, from being disclosed without the patient's consent or knowledge. So this is a really kind of important baseline to set and think about here when we talk about some of these words and why these things are important. Additionally, I want to give you one more definition before we start to move on to a sort of a history or timeline of patient communities and sort of the e-patient community. So one other thing that I think Andrea may talk to us a little bit about today, but if we don't get to it, we only do have 30 minutes. So we're going to try to end with 5 minutes early, is something called FHIR, F-H-I-R, if you have not heard about this. Essentially, it's a standard for exchanging health information electronically. And this is really important, right? A lot of us, we're out there to some degree. We've had a health provider take care of us. And we want to figure out, how do we go to another hospital and sort of move that data around, right? So FHIR essentially provides a means for representing and sharing information. It's got some really interesting technical components to it. So the standards are from HL7, which is an international nonprofit organization. But really, it's easier to implement. So it's a web-based suite of API technologies. Uses an HTTP REST-based protocol, HTML, cascading style sheets for interface design, has a choice of JSON, XML, or RDF for data representation, and Atom for results. So really,
put it up on the screen. So
that's a good idea. So people can look at it. That's a really good idea. So you can kind of look here. So you can, if you want to really understand the details, it's very important. It's got a lot of really crazy, really intense details in it. Let's just say that, if you want to dig into this. So thanks for sharing that. It's a really good resource for people to look at. If you can't see the screen there, it's just hl7.org. You can also Google FHIR, F-H-I-R, or put it into whatever other browser you want, if it's DuckDuckGo or Bing or whatever you might be using. Do people still use Bing? That's okay. All right, so let's go away from the screen share. And now we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the history or timeline of the e-patient community, which really started a pretty long time ago. And all the way back, maybe in 1975, if we can go back to then, there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Tom Ferguson. And it's really kind of important that I think those of us in the e-patient community recognize Doc Tom, as he was known to a lot of people, really wrote about what he called the empowered medical consumer. Which is a really interesting concept to think about, the empowered medical consumer. We hear a lot about it today. So when Doc Tom actually passed away, people called him like the George Washington of patient empowerment, right? It was really interesting. He had something that was published. It's clearly not going to show up on the screen, so I won't show it to you, but it was in the Healthcare Forum Journal in 1995. If you want to look it up, it's a pyramid essentially broken down into a couple of different shapes that showed at the very base, the biggest component of this pyramid was self-care, which is essentially off the map, right? And using how can you utilize different things, whether it's data points or something else, to really show your own healthcare, which falls outside of professional care. Beyond that, there are some people really important in our history of the e-patient community. One of them being Michael Cohen, whose work on medical errors over 30 years ago led him to found the Institute for Safe Medical Practices. In 1995, Gilles Friedman has experienced with his wife's cancer, actually, in 1996, led him to co-found ACOR, which is the Association of Cancer Online Resources. And it was really the first large-scale online social network for cancer patients and caregivers. It changed into something called Smart Patients. And then Isabel Duran, this was really interesting, was a news anchor who had Hodgkin's disease, led her to start an organization called Latinos Contra Cancer. Later in 2004, Trisha Torrey, whose incorrect cancer diagnosis led her to start Diagnosis. That's like KNOWSIS, a little pun on words there. And in 2006, Victoria and Armando Nahum, whose son's death from an in-hospital infection led them to form the Safe Care campaign. In 2006, the NIHR, National Institutes for Health Research in the UK, was set up. But really in 2011, really a program was funded and started at Stanford called Stanford Medicine X to cultivate e-patient scholars and bring them front and center to healthcare as patient leaders. So the program has since had about 165 patient leaders, including myself and Andrea, go through that from 70 countries, including what we like to call as hacktivists, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with the term. There are really a lot of great stories, one of which I want to highlight for you is one of our fellow e-patients really changed the industry with something called Open APS. So you can look this up, open and then the letters APS for Artificial Pancreas Movement. I don't know, maybe if you want to bring this up on the screen, Andrea, since we are able to do that.
What I was going to suggest is, there are a few hashtags that we're going to throw out, and this one lasted about 10 years, and it's a open source movement for the diabetes community. And I'll hand it back to you, but I'll share the hashtag, and while you're talking.
That'll be great. Yeah, the fact that we can share the screen while we're doing this is great. That is an added bonus to this today. So really it was the do-it-yourself pancreas system. She was a diabetic. She is a diabetic. She's still alive. And she really hacked into this system that said, why are there are all these applications out there, and they're all tied to their different devices that diabetic patients are using. But why can't we sort of have one central place to look at data, kind of monitor these as communities? And so they hacked into this and have really kind of revolutionized the way diabetes patients monitor their care. It's a major open source movement that has had an impact for patients all over the globe. And so you can look this up. Yeah. That's a good image we've got on the screen right now. That's Dana. And so it's a really fascinating community to follow along with, kind of look at what they've been doing. I do want to focus on, before I hand this over to Andrea, just two things really quickly. One of which is another e-patient advocate who was really a close friend of a lot of ours who passed recently. And so I do want to take a moment to talk briefly about him. His name was Michael Series. So a lot of us, right, who are e-patients, we have major medical challenges. And so occasionally we do lose members of our community. So Michael was the inventor of a device called the Alfred Smart Bag. He really was a hacker, right? He solved a problem that he faced as a patient, and he founded a company called 11 Health. There he is. It's a great picture of him, and he passed away recently. It was a real big loss for the community. He was one of a small number of patient inventors who helped design this medical device, and essentially it's a digitally enhanced ostomy bag, OSTOMY. It got FDA clearance in 2004, and Michael had Crohn's, but he also had an intestinal transplant, bone marrow transplant, and 5 bouts of cancer, if you can imagine. And really his invention eased the suffering of millions of people with bowel injuries, chronic gut illnesses, cancers. He really was a giant in the community then, and we will certainly miss him. So Andrea is going to talk to you about some more hashtags, including the BCSM hashtag, which is an amazing hashtag and community. The BTSM, brain tumor social media. BCSM is breast cancer social media, has almost about 1 billion impressions now. And so the questions that Andrea and I try to talk about, we've recently formed our own cybersecurity shop here. Is really, where does the hacker community go next with regard to Hipaa? We're really in unprecedented times for a number of reasons. And the next step in the patient community is what happens. And so I'll leave you with one thought as Andrea takes over. This Hipaa legislation that we talked about, it was drafted 8 years before Facebook came into being and 11 years before the first iPhone was released. So that puts it in a little bit of perspective for you to show you how far we've come. Andrea, if you want to kind of take it away to talk about the threats and harms to the communities.
Sure. And if I may, and this is me
Yes.
kind of my comfort with blanket, because it's hard not to present without slides and when I'm seeing something. So if it's okay, I'm going to share a few pictures. I wanted to start with kind of the about me of how I look at this world and where I started. So for me, a lot of this began when I, 14 years ago, didn't know how to navigate a huge learning curve when it came to BRCA. And this is about 7 years into my path. I had a bilateral mastectomy, and we're called previvors. We are people who are told our futures. We are, a community that often falls through the cracks of the healthcare system. And in many ways, that wasn't something that I really understood until I became what we called, and we coined the term with a few people in our community. We called ourselves bractivists, because it was easier to say than activists who carried BRCA mutations and had a high risk of cancer. And my first foray into this work was here on the steps of the Supreme Court back in 2013. And I'll stop and just tell the story really quickly. There was a case then in federal court on whether human genes could be patented. And that case in question was looking at BRCA1 and 2, and the company that had done the diagnostics was the company that had done my genetic testing. Well, these patents kept our community from getting access to an important test. It was $4,000 when it, at the time could have been much, much more affordable. And I started learning about, the importance of our data to become, as a community, the stewards of good resources, good diagnostics, good knowledge that is often either used against us or monetized in ways that do not actually directly benefit us. Well, I'm going to share another picture, which is, fast forwarding, 7 years up. And this, again, looking through the breast cancer community is the BCSM hashtag. So they now have this incredible, thriving community on Twitter. They meet every Monday, and we have all kinds of identities of different types of breast cancer. There's triple negative breast cancer. The previvor community is involved in this, and the founder of Alicia Staley is actually an engineer. has taught me a lot about the e-patient movement. So the other thing, and let me just go to, I would say the next part of my story. So a lot of that for the first 5 years was around the good type of data sharing, the life-saving data sharing that I wanted my community to be involved with. And I was literally back in 2013, this poster child for a campaign called Free the Data. But then I started to understand how my community and other communities like my own, like Mike's, could have data that can be weaponized against us. And that's where I want to kind of share the story of finding a massive zero-day vulnerability, becoming an accidental hacker, and following through a timeline, asking myself a simple question in March 2018 after the news of Cambridge Analytica broke. Basically, I was asking myself, what are the implications of having a health support group on social media, specifically Facebook? And you have to understand, I have this background in technology. So before I tested positive for a mutation, I worked in tech. I had an understanding of, APIs, endpoints, and data flows. I just didn't really know how that was impacting my community. So I started looking under the hood of Facebook and really asking myself, what are the threat models here and how the is going to be used against us? And so I became a hacker. Accidentally, and I like this picture of Angelina Jolie because she's back in 2013, one of the, I guess, famous people, and she's also in the movie Hacker. So anyway, I'm a dork. So what did I find? If you go to hashtag sickgirl, SICGRL, this is the vulnerability that we've been navigating as communities for the last 2 years. And basically it's an acronym for strict inclusion criteria group reverse lookup. What I found at the time, which meant much of this has been closed, but still there are aspects of it I'm still, navigating with Facebook and fighting Facebook on. It has to do with being able to take different data tables from their group architecture and their API. Some of these have since been closed, but match them to lists that could have been programmatically scraped before they closed their user interface, and the ability to show group lists in 2018. So here's the timeline. So I basically found this and brought this to a security researcher. His name is Fred Trotter, and he, as a health data cybersecurity expert, has advised Congress on these things, and validated that we could programmatically scrape things, not only for my group and the things that I was studying, but they impacted all groups on Facebook. In May 2018, we brought a 40-page vulnerability report to Facebook. We had a lot of back and forth with their responsible disclosure team. We got a response back basically that the vulnerability that we found was actually not a bug, it was by design, and they will thank us for our product feedback and kick it over to their product team. We wrote an open letter saying that this was unacceptable and co-signed it from many of the leaders and organizers in the hereditary cancer community that had groups on Facebook that were trapped. And then in July 2018, there was a whole lot of headlines about closing what they called a privacy loophole, which was the ability to scrape these groups from the user interface and then attach it to data that was available within the API. That wasn't enough, however, we had, in our view and on our position, a thesis that Facebook had violated the PHR breach notification rule. And I'll go back to, Mike talked a little bit about Hipaa. Any data, any health data for communities where patients live outside of a HIPAA covered entity are not protected by Hipaa. And people often think, oh, if your health data is out there, it can't be used against you. That's really not the case. There's only one rule governed outside of HIPAA covered entities that protects health data, and that's the PHR breach notification rule, which the FTC does have authority to enforce. So we went to the FTC with a complaint in December. However, unfortunately, in the $5 billion settlement that happened last year, and the challenge that just got decided in federal court in May, which was, what month is this? This is July.
July?
It's all, yeah. So there was a challenge to that FTC settlement, and we had specific arguments around health data. That challenge was not allowed to move forward in the courts. So that leaves us where we are today. So what are examples of harm? Again, we're talking about community. It's not just about, I'm sharing this story because I look through the lens of BRCA and our shared identity within the breast cancer community. But this applies to much broader problems on Facebook that I think we all know about. But I think in my mind, I would really love the stakeholders and the people within the InfoSec community to kind of join forces with us as we think about a path forward, because I have seen firsthand the harm. Here's one example of something that happened right around the time they closed the major part of the biggest permutation of Sick Girl. There was a group of sexual assault survivors that it was about 15,000 women were hacked, scraped, and deleted on Facebook. They were viciously doxxed. You know, these are things that I have no words to put to, you know, when we think about a community and a safe space or a sacred space. Like, you know, I've got the Pantheon behind me. It's a sacred space. Well, these support groups, to a lot of people with very little technical literacy or understanding of the group architecture, all of a sudden found themselves in a place where they were being abused, trolled, doxxed, and then quietly Facebook swept it under the rug with no recourse.
Honestly, I was getting angry just seeing Mark Zuckerberg's face. Just seeing his face makes me angry.
Don't we all? I think the question is, what is the path forward? Because, you know, another problem with this is, here's another example. There was a group of 500,000 people, and it was a grief support group for widows, people who have lost a loved one. And this was taken over in a slightly different way, but the hacker had basically taken the group for ransom and then started, you know, using the admin privileges to push out really traumatic, horrible things to this support group. There's also examples of how this, and what I'm going through, by the way, are real world examples of what everybody knows is threat modeling. These are some examples of how our original threat model, when we wrote this as a 0-day vulnerability back in May 2018, then started to unfold. Another example is this predatory behavior of addiction support groups being used to broker patients, or even nefarious, you know, drug companies with unproven solutions or quack solutions that have a financial interest or conflict of interest, setting up a group on Facebook for the guise of support, and then using and scraping the data to make money.
I hate to do this to you too, but I'm going to give you like 1 more minute because we're already 2 minutes into the other person's time slot.
So that's the question. I'm going to stop there actually and say what we found ourselves navigating is so much bigger than I ever thought. I didn't ask to be like in this world as a hacker, but now that I've found the hacker community, I feel so empowered, because I think Mike and I see the possibilities living at the intersection of these two worlds, and we need to find a path forward.
So you were showing Angelina Jolie from Hackers. I mean, I'm sure in your community you're aware that she has gone through the same things herself with her breast cancer risk. She had a preventative mastectomy, just like you did.
I'm glad you picked up what I was laying down, which is, you know, that's one of the gifts I love, just because, you know, yes, she is definitely one of the people who brought the BRCA dialogue out into the open and changed things for our identity. And a lot of this is about, you know, preserving and being the stewards of our identity as communities, and not having our communities used against us. That's all I have to say. And I'd love to say more, but I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah. Yeah,
You
Kim,
guys
thank
have
you very
been
much for having us.
medical security is incredibly important. I've really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, everyone.
So I'm gonna kick you guys out now. And now